So again, tonight's topic is going to be pasture nutrition. We're shifting again to still about pastures, but kind of looking at it a little bit from the animal perspective and kind of meshing the two together. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about animal nutrition, because it really doesn't matter what we feed them. They have the same nutritional requirements, whether they're a pastured animal, whether an animal that's raised in confinement, whether they're half the year in confinement and half the year on pasture, whether they're in Idaho, whether they're in Florida, whether they're in Maine, whether they're in Maryland. They all have the same requirements. Energy is the most important and usually the most limiting nutrient. Is what they consume the most of. We typically, in small ruminants, we're not real sophisticated in our nutrition. We usually talk about TDN, which stands for total digestible nutrients. The dairy industry and the swine and the poultry industry, they're a lot more sophisticated in looking at the nutritional standpoint. The mic is cutting in and out. Is it still cutting in and out? I haven't changed anything. Jeff is muted. Everything at my end says everything's okay. Jeff's going to pipe in with what he's hearing. It's cutting in and out. Not sure what I can do. Okay now? I moved a cord. I hoped it helped. I moved a cord. So again, getting back to the nutrient requirements, energy being the most important one. Again, the most limiting factor. It does depend on where you're at in terms of forage quality, but usually energy is also the most limiting factor in pastured animals. Protein obviously is a very important nutrient. The abbreviation is wrong. It should be CP, not CD, crude protein. There are various measures of protein as well, and again, when we do small ruminant nutrition, we tend to use the crudest, which is the crude protein. When we're talking about ruminants, though, there's two different types of protein. There's the degradable intake protein, the protein that is degraded in the rumen, and then there's the undegradable intake protein, which bypasses the rumen. You often hear it called bypass protein, and they're able to directly utilize it from the abomasum. We want the diet to contain both. And in many cases, from a nutritional standpoint, we specifically want to feed them the undegradable intake protein. There's definitely some advantages to doing that. Nutrient requirements include minerals, of course. What we call macro minerals are those that are required in larger quantities, although the quantities are still in the grams per day. It's not that these minerals are necessarily more important, because you'll notice selenium is in the micromineral category, and that is one of our most important minerals. They're just required in larger quantities. Typically when we balance rations, we tend to also balance them for, in addition to protein and energy, we tend to also balance for calcium and phosphorus. We don't often go into greater detail. The other minerals are just as important, but because they're in more minute quantities, we don't tend to balance for them like we do calcium and phosphorus. Of course, NaCl is salt, and that's also one that's consumed in a greater quantity. Chloride, magnesium, potassium, and sulfur. The microminerals, cobalt, copper, of course, very important, particularly when we talk about kind of the differences with sheep having a much lower tolerance for excess copper. Forages can fit right in there. We can increase the copper content of forages, for example, by fertilizing with poultry or pig manure. Things that have to do with soil fertility can affect copper. And so the minerals are very important. Again, selenium, a very important mineral. Zinc has a lot to do with the strength of hoofs. So a lot of these minerals play a lot of important roles, and of course, they need to get them whether they're in a forage diet or whether they're eating their dinner out of a bucket or a feeder. Vitamins the same way. We tend to classify them as either water-soluble or fat-soluble vitamins. Of course, ruminants do not have a dietary requirement for B vitamins. Those vitamins are manufactured in the rumen. That's why a lot of times when a ruminant goes off feed, one of the ways we treat them is by giving them B complex vitamins. So they do have dietary requirements for A, D, and E. E, of course, E and selenium being very closely related. So again, it doesn't matter where they're getting their feed. They have these same nutritional requirements. Same thing with water. I always throw water in as a nutrient. It's, I guess technically maybe it's not, but it's the most important thing they consume. When we develop pasture systems, it can be one of the most challenging aspects of developing a grazing system, particularly as we develop a more intensive grazing system, making sure we always have water available to the animals, and then of course dealing with water at a time like this. I mean, not everybody has barns with automatic waterers, but we have to make sure we provide water, and we have to make sure we know what the requirements are, because they do vary by animals. Now, nutrient requirements that an animal requires, it's important to remember that they don't require a percentage. You know, they don't require a 14% crude protein diet. They require the nutrients in so much per day. So many pounds, so many kilograms, so many grams, so many ounces. So in the bigger nutrients like protein and energy, we usually talk about pounds or kilograms. The minerals, we talk about grams or ounces. And a lot of the vitamins, we talk about international units or parts per million. So keep in mind, it's always the amount that they require and not necessarily the quality, which makes pasture diets or forage-based diets more difficult in certain ways. If I'm putting everything for that animal to eat in a feeder, I can very easily balance their ration or balance their diet because I know how much they're eating. When they're out there free grazing, I don't know how much they're consuming. So the only thing I can really look at is quality. And then I assume if there's enough quantity out there that they should be able to meet that requirement. But it's a little bit harder, and so we approach things a little bit differently than if we're balancing for a feedlot or confinement diet. The other thing, of course, that's important is to understand that nutrient requirements vary by species. There are differences between goats and sheep. There's even differences between meat goats and dairy goats and different breeds. On average, goats require a higher percentage of their body weight to maintain themselves than a sheep does. A dairy goat requires more feed to maintain its body weight than a meat goat does. Certainly the size of the animal. Certainly a Southdown doesn't need as much feed as a Suffolk. A pygmy doesn't need as much feed as a Saanen. And again, that presents problems with grazing in the sense, well, they're all being exposed to the same ration. Body condition. Sometimes we need to add condition to our animals, and sometimes we need to subtract condition from our animals. The sex, males tend to have higher requirements. The age of the animal, certainly young, growing animals have much higher nutritional requirements than mature animals. Mature meaning just, not necessarily pregnant or lactating. The stage and level of production, again, is she dry? Are you breeding her? Is she pregnant? What part of pregnancy is she in? Is she lactating? What part of lactation is she in? Those requirements change. The climate, environment, and amount of activity can affect their nutrient requirements. This time of year, it's cold. You guys know that. If your livestock are outside, they have higher nutritional requirements than those that are housed inside. Lambs and kids need more colostrum if they're in a colder environment than those in a warmer environment. If the animals have to go far, use up a lot of energy to graze, that's going to increase their nutritional requirements. If you ever try to balance a ration for goats using Langston University's nutrient calculator, one of the things it'll ask you is about the level of activity of the goats. Same thing in the old nutrient requirements for goats. They used to separate out requirements for goats based on the level of activity. So most of the nutrient requirements nowadays, they're for sheep that are in metabolism crates or animals that are in metabolism crates that are in confinement. So they don't consider the extra nutrition that that they need because of the environment, whether it's because it's cold, whether it's because they're having to travel far, or whether it's because they're carrying a parasite load. Those nutrient requirements don't include that. So what you would have to do is you would have to add to them. Okay, so these are the things the animal needs. Now let's go back to the forage, and I know that Jeff showed you some of the graphs or some of the pictures that I'm going to show you. And the first thing, again, is looking at some different forages and what their growth patterns are. And again, as Jeff has said several times, our perspective is at mid-Atlantic. You may have different growth patterns for some of these species based on where you're located, and you may have different species, like we don't have Bahia grass up here. Even in a state like Maryland, I can tell you that the growth curve for our cool season grasses is going to be different in western Maryland, particularly our westernmost county, than it's going to be in the southern eastern shore. I imagine right now there's sometimes a 20-degree difference in temperature. There's about a month more of winter at both ends as you get to our far western counties. So there's even going to be differences within the same state. But these give us the general idea. These curves give us the general idea of how these forages grow when they produce the majority of their growth. The picture you see of the forage here is actually forage sorghum. We use that, it's an annual. We used it on our buck test in 2013. So, you know, again, it would have more of a growth pattern like that pearl millet. It's going to do all of its growth in the summertime. Here specifically is a graph for Kentucky tall fescue, one of the dominant forages, not just in the mid-Atlantic, but going farther south, a lot of places. Again, your curve might look slightly different based on where you're at. It also doesn't include, say, if you were going to stockpile any of it. It's just based on when it's going to naturally grow. The two little graphs off to the right just show you what would happen if you fertilized. So you can adjust these curves to some degree with fertilization. So applying nitrogen, and I don't have any graphs, but also incorporating legumes that are going to fix nitrogen. Okay, so you can adjust those. And then, of course, the other thing to think about, and we're going to talk a little bit about this tonight, is that this is assuming a pure stand of Kentucky 31 tall fescue. What about if you had red clover in there? You know, how are you going to, change the total growth of the pasture when you do pasture mixes? Because most of us hopefully don't do monocultures. We're not going to get very far growing lambs and kids if we just have cool season grasses. Okay, I can't remember if Jeff showed you these graphs, but these are fairly common. They're used a lot in books and classes, and just kind of a reminder of what happens as the plant grows. It's kind of like that when you cut hay. If you cut it only for yield and get a lot of hay and a lot of pounds, it's not going to be very high quality. Conversely, if you cut it at the early stage when the plants are most nutritious, you're not going to get a lot of yield. So we tend to balance it in terms of cutting hay. But always remember, as the plants get more mature, their nutrient quality goes down, whether we're talking protein, whether we're talking energy, whether we're talking minerals and vitamins. The other thing that happens is the palatability goes down. So their needs are based on quantity of nutrients. So if the forage quality is low, they're also going to eat less of it because it doesn't taste as good, and then their performance is going to suffer as a result. So this is a graph on the left, shows you basically grasses, cool season grasses, and then one on the right shows you legumes. Okay. So the animals require quantity of nutrients, but we don't specifically know how much they're eating when we have them out there grazing. So we have to look at quality. That's the only thing we can really measure from the forage standpoint is quality. There are certainly things that we can look at from the animal standpoint to determine if the diet is adequate, but what can we do with the forage? How can we determine the forage quality? And there's two ways to do that. Caught this cute little picture of a goat eating one end and pooping the other end. Okay? We're concerned about both ends. So we can sample the forage to see what the likely quality of that animal's diet is, what we're offering him, and hopefully what he's choosing to eat. We're going to watch that. We can sample from the other end. We can sample the feces to determine the actual quality of diet that the goat consumed, or the sheep consumed. So if we're going to sample the pasture for nutritional analysis, and I know that Jeff talked about this in his presentations, the link right below the title is a link of certified forage testing laboratories. There's a whole list of them that are certified. The link on the lower right corner, Cumberland Valley Analytical Services, this is the one that's located near us. It's a very good lab, and you see its website. So you want to sample the pasture right when they first have access to it. You want to watch to see what plants they're eating and which ones they're avoiding. And I would imagine this is particularly more important with goats because goats have a higher nutritional requirement than cows and even than sheep. They have to select a more nutritious diet. And so a lot of things they select, you might have planted this and then they choose to eat this. So it's important to watch them graze, to see what they take, to take samples from the whole pasture, to tear the plant like you would the animal grazing. Usually about a gallon-sized plastic bag is what you need. And you can take, in our cases, we can take the samples to this lab, or you can mail them. You can also freeze them until you mail them. And you're going to get back a report that's going to, and the extent of how much you want in the report is you can get some very basic information, but the more money you pay, the more detail you can get. Like I can't remember, I don't think we get selenium or copper in our basic analysis. So you can get, you look at what they have to offer and what they're going to provide you with, and then if you want additional information, they can do other analysis to get them. Because we get back to those minerals. Really the only way you can know if you're meeting mineral requirements is to be able to sample. It's not going to be on your feed tag. You buy a bag of feed and it's on the feed tag, tells you how much the minerals are in there, but if you want to know the forages, you're going to have to test them. It'll give you calcium and phosphorus, but you might need some. You might want to see the other ones, especially if you're concerned you might have a deficiency problem. Of course, that's not the only way to find deficiencies. You can also do sampling of the animals, tissue samples. Okay, these are some of the forage tests we've done in the last couple of years with our buck test. This year, the goats started the test on the cool season grasses, and then they finished the test on our warm season annual grasses and legumes. Sun hemp is a warm season legume. It's an Asian legume. I think Jeff talked about that a little bit in the last session. Dwarf pearl millet is an annual forage. Similar looking to the sorghum that I showed you in the picture. Then, of course, you're all familiar with orchard grass. So he took these samples about July 14th. He took just the sun hemp, which is kind of a stalk with these leaves, and then the dwarf pearl millet, which is the thick blade grass. He took a sample of that, and their pasture was actually, that was the pasture mix. And at the same time they had access to that, they had access to an acre of orchard grass. This particular orchard grass had not previously been grazed by the goats, so it had ended up being mowed once. So you can look to see, would you have predicted these kind of numbers without actually testing the forage? The protein level of these warm season grasses and legumes was extremely high. 20% for the sun hemp, 22% for the mix, very high in TDN. If you were to buy a bag of feed, sheep feed, goat feed, I would say that they don't list it on the bag, but the TDN is going to be about 72. So TDN of something like corn is going to be up around 88, barley about 84, oats are going to be maybe a little bit higher than 72. Just to give you perspective, most of your hays are going to be around 58. So these are pretty high levels of energy. If you can look at the relative feed value of this forage and consider that alfalfa is usually considered 100. And I forget which stage of alfalfa, where the hay is cut, but using it as a standard of 100, you can see the sun hemp, And both of those warm season pastures were incredible. You switch down to that orchard grass, you're in the middle of the summer, it's cool season grass, it's largely dormant, protein level about 10%, TDN level of a little bit lower quality hay would be its equivalent, 73% relative feed value. Not horrible, but not necessarily the type of forage you want to grow these young bucks on. The other thing that was interesting to me is, and it's fairly typical, when pastures are in more of a vegetative state, one of the challenges is that they're very high in moisture. So these warm seasons were less than 20% dry matter. The orchard grass was more than twice as much dry matter. So a bite of the orchard grass, which wasn't as nutritious, but because of its dry matter, they would get the equivalent amount of protein out of that orchard grass. The sorghum that I showed you a picture of a couple of slides ago, that was from the 2013 test, and you can see that the protein percentage was pretty high. The TDN wasn't quite as good as the forages we planted last year, but still pretty good. In another year, Jeff, and this was several years ago, Jeff wanted to sample some of the weeds because we know that's what goats like. We also at the time had some paddocks of chicory. Chicory is a forage that's really being promoted for grazing small ruminants. There's some belief or some evidence that it has some of an anti-parasitic effect. The goats and the sheep, when we had them, they both grazed it really well. So the protein content of what we're calling mixed weeds, which was a variety of different weeds, was up around 14%. The chicory was 14%. To me, that would be perfectly, pretty much in line with what young meat goats would need. The TDN of the chicory was excellent. The mixed weeds wasn't bad either. Relative feed value is pretty high. But of course, the most interesting thing of all is the lamb's quarters. Very much what we consider a weed. Incredible nutrition. Incredible. 23.2% protein, almost 90% TDN. Relative feed value almost 300. See, goats are smart. Sheep are smart. They know where good nutrition is. So we think we know things about forages, but the forage test can really tell us what's really out there. No. And does that mean that's what the animal got? That's the question. So we can test the feces to actually see the quality of the diet that the animal is eating. Of course, this is a prediction too, but it's based on a lot of science behind it, different equations that are used to predict the content or quality of the forage diet that the animal ate in the last 36 to 48 hours. So last year's buck test, for the very first time, we collected fecal samples to have that analyzed. The data that we get back is crude protein and energy. We also get fecal nitrogen and phosphorus. So in this case, we need to collect the samples after the animals have been out there a couple of days. We should collect samples from about 10% of the herd or flock. Unlike collecting a sample for a fecal test, these samples I was able just to pick up off the ground if they were fresh. I didn't have to collect them from the animal. We need about a quarter-size plastic bag with the feces. Much like the forage, we keep it cool, we can freeze it, and then we mail it or drop it off. The lab that we used was in Texas, so obviously we mailed it. There could be other labs that do this. Someone told me here locally in Washington County somebody did it, but I don't think that Cumberland Analytical does it. So again, we worked with Grazing Land Animal Nutrition Lab in Texas. We sent off 6 samples. I actually waited till I put 3 together, put them in the freezer right next to the butter, and waited till I had 3 samples to ship. So the first 3, the bucks came in early June. So the first 3 are while they're on those cool season grasses. Our cool season grasses would have included orchard grass, Max Q tall fescue. So we planted the one that has the endophyte but doesn't have the negative aspects of the endophyte. And then the July 3rd one was actually a pasture that was, we call it our I don't know, it's in an area where trees have been planted. Walnut trees on one side and mixed hardwoods on the other. It's got a lot more mixture of plants in there, including more weeds and forbs. In fact, I think that was probably their favorite pasture, plus it provided a lot of extra shade. The 3 samples afterwards were grazing those warm season annuals, the sun hemp, the dwarf pearl millet. We also had some cowpeas, but I would say the majority of it would have probably been the sun hemp and the dwarf pearl millet. So if you look at the data on these, they're all pretty decent in protein. I mean, I can tell you that being up in the 20s, again, if it was a diet coming out of a feeder, we would not feed goats 21% protein ration. So these are very high protein feeds. The DOM stands for digestive organic matter. It's not quite the same as TDN, but it's basically measuring the same thing. But I don't think I would equate them to TDN, because when you look at particularly the last sample on August 20th, that's a pretty low. If that was TDN, 38.3 is pretty low. But you can kind of see where those numbers are. The thing that they look at in this is to relate the energy and protein. And they want it to be ideally up around 4 for cows. And that ratio certainly depends on the content of the pasture. The vegetative type pastures, again, are going to be much higher in moisture. They're going to go through them quicker. You get to some of, as you get older plants or higher dry matter, that's certainly going to affect some of those numbers. But they like it to be around 4. These numbers being below 3 were an indication that these goats' diet is deficient in energy. And we began feeding the bucks soy hulls at the end of, or halfway through the test. And we didn't do it based on these results because we had planned to do it already. We were going to do it halfway through the test, but it certainly supported that decision. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But this data, the forage data, was telling us that we had very nutritious plants in terms of the warm season grasses. This data here shows us that the diet, or the goats are getting more than enough protein, but their diet is deficient in energy. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is matching forage production with animal production. Thinking about what those animals need and thinking about how those forages grow and other things you might be able to plant and other management decisions and other factors that might come into play. And I like to think of sheep and goat production almost as 2 different enterprises. We talk about feeding the female, the breeding doe, the breeding ewe, and nursing her young up to the point that we wean them. In the case of a dairy animal, we're talking about her milk production. Okay? The other enterprise is, unless you sell those lambs and kids at weaning, or in the case of dairy, you sell them fairly soon after they're born, we're going to have another enterprise, and that's going to be growing out these lambs and kids. And I even think of it, even if you don't wean, even if you left the lambs and kids on their moms for 6 or 7 months, up after a certain point, they're still going to be getting most of the nutrition from what they're eating. So even if we don't separate them, you still got to almost think of them as separate. I'm going to go through 3 scenarios. The first one is if you were lambing and kidding in the wintertime, basically now, or a little bit earlier. And for my example, I'm going to use, this is their energy requirements, because this is the bulk of what they need. And they need so many pounds of energy, or TDN, per day. And I'm going to use a 176-pound ewe and a 132-pound doe, and they're producing twins. The bars represent their energy requirements for those different stages in their production cycle. The taller bar is the ewe, the lower bar is the doe, but the trends are going to be basically the same. There's not very many times when the trend is going to be different. So in this case, we're going to lamb or kid in January. Okay? So you can see that that's her highest requirement. The sheep's highest requirement. The goats, they're actually a little bit higher in late gestation. So late gestation, the last month of pregnancy would have been in December, and you can see that the energy requirements were higher. So in January, she's lambed or kidded, and that's her requirement for early lactation. February, mid-lactation. March, late lactation, and we're going to wean her. The vertical axis is pounds of TDN per day. Pounds of energy per day. Okay? So after we wean her, the babies, we're just talking about mom right now, you can see April through July, her requirements aren't very high. She's dry and she's not doing much. 132-pound doe is a small dairy doe, but it's not a small meat goat doe. So it wouldn't matter what size we pick, the trends are going to be the same. I just happen to have to pick one example. In August, we're going to breed, so requirements go up a little bit. September, October, November, early to mid-gestation, then again December. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to plop the growth curves on there. I can't tell you how many times I had to draw that freehand. So please bear with me in terms of my artwork. So if I look at this as a typical cool season grass growth pattern, you can see that when my doe and ewe need feed the most because they're lactating, I don't have any. I don't have any. By the time I get to breeding, I don't have a lot. As I get into gestation, I get that second spurt of growth in the fall. One of the ways I can deal with winter is what probably you're doing right now, which is you're feeding. You're feeding harvested forage. Another option would be this graphic is meant to represent something like tall fescue. If I had stockpiled tall fescue, it can provide, it's a way of extending the grazing season, and Jeff talked about that. Stockpiled tall fescue is one. There's other plants like brassicas. There are certain things, small grains that can be planted to extend the grazing season and get some winter grazing. Now, if I had those ewes and does right now on stockpiled tall fescue, it would provide some nutrition for them, but it wouldn't be sufficient. They'd still need to be supplemented because they're at their high part of their nutrient requirements. Now we're going to look at the babies, because again, I want to look at two separate enterprises. So the brown line is going to be my sheep, my lamb, and the gray line is going to be my kid. They're just kind of arbitrary lines. If there was a vertical axis, you could think of that as body weight. So we expect that they're going to increase in size as they get older and they feed. So they're born in January. Again, we're going to wean them about in March. If I plop those curves on again, you can see a couple of things that are important to notice. One, there's nothing for them to eat in January, February, and March. I mean, obviously they nurse their mother, and they're probably going to eat whatever she eats. But most of the time, when you lamb and kid in the wintertime, you're going to creep feed. Now, by the time these lambs are weaned, especially if you moved lambing a little bit and kidding a little bit later, they're going to be right ready for that flush spring pasture. They're going to have plenty of feed right there. You had to supplement the ewes or do something else with the ewes, but the lambs and kids are going to have feed. So in this scenario, I would look at selling these at weaning for Easter or getting them off on market by July 1. By July 1, when typically before prices often go down in the summer, before parasites become a problem. That would be how I would match up a winter lambing program, winter kidding program with these forages. We're going to move to spring. We're going to have kids and lambs in April. So that's when our highest nutritional requirements are. We're going to wean them again 2 or 3 months later, and even if I don't separate them from their dams, it's still important to realize that the dams' nutritional requirements are not high, but the kids and lambs will be. So let's match our curves. And in this case, we can see that spring flush of forage does a pretty good job matching the nutritional requirements of that lactating female. Particularly if you even lambed or kidded a little bit later in May. If you went to May, you'd probably have a perfect match. And then when you went to breed in November, you'd kind of have that second, again, spurt of growth with these cool season grasses in the fall. And again, I can do something with stockpile fescue or planting something else. In this case, that stockpile fescue up to late gestation would probably provide enough nutrition. In late gestation, I'd probably need to supplement ahead of lambing and kidding, because their late gestation in this case is in March. If we moved that, if we lambed and kidded in May, again, it would probably perfectly match the cycle. Okay, now we're going to switch to the babies again. Again, they're born in April, weaning them in the middle of summer. Their moms had plenty of forage to eat, but by the time they're ready to be weaned and start eating and growing, there isn't much in the summer. And again, we're not pretending, but we're talking about cool seasons. Cool seasons. So, how am I going to deal with this? Well, I could put them on feed, or I could plant legumes. If you look at the growth patterns of something like alfalfa, especially alfalfa, but even some of the other legumes, they have better growth in the summertime. So if you're going to try to finish lambs and kids in the summertime, you're going to have to plant something, or you're going to have a goal of doing something in the summer to provide good forage. The other alternative would be kind of hold them. Kind of hold them through the summer till you get that, till the fall forages come in. Hold them. Now the thing to keep in mind about that kind of that valley is not only have the cool season grasses become more dormant, you've also got the humidity and the parasites that these lambs and kids have to deal with. Another alternative would be to plant a warm season annual, annual grass or legume or both, much like we did with the goats in our performance test. So that would be another alternative. And if you had ewes that needed nutrition in the summer, again, same kind of thing is how you would attack that. This is our fall lambing and kidding scenario. A lot of advantages to lambing in the fall and kidding in the fall. The biggest challenge, of course, is that even though there's differences, for the most part, sheep and goats want to breed in the fall and lamb and kid in the spring, and so you're not going to get them all to conceive. But you could take at least a portion of the flock. So in this case, we're lambing and kidding in September and weaning a little bit before Christmas. Match our forage curves up, and the fall growth, it doesn't do too bad a job on lactation. We've got a lot of forage in the spring. We may have to mow it. We may have to cut hay because the nutritional requirements, she'll be in mid-pregnancy. She's probably not going to utilize all that. Again, as I look at that ewe for the whole year, the option of stockpiled forages, planting brassicas or small grains. You see the little red clover there through the summer because she's going to be in late lactation in the summer, late gestation, mid to late gestation, and you're probably going to want better feed for her, forage for her as she's gestating. If I switch to the lambs and kids, again, born in September, weaned right before Christmas. This is the ideal scenario for marketing these lambs and kids at Christmas time for premium prices. Prices tend to go up at Christmas and Easter. They also tend to go up at the end of the year and even after the beginning of the year. It's a good time if you're going to lamb out of season, kid out of season. You've got forage to grow those lambs and kids. Your alternative is going to be after you wean them, you're going to have something for them to graze on. Stockpiled fescue is probably still going to need to be supplemented, probably still not a good enough quality feed for young lambs. The other picture there is brassicas. That would probably be a better choice. But you're going to have to, if you don't sell them at that point, for the Christmas market, you're going to have to do something. You can have them on hay. There's different things you can do, but you're going to have to fill that gap. So let's talk a little bit of, I hope those graphs made sense. I kind of enjoyed putting them together and trying to look at, kind of back up and look at trying to match forages with production and looking at where the gaps are and where you might need to fill those gaps. You can fill the gaps sometimes with forages, or a lot of times with forages, especially if you have a bigger farm, you have equipment. But a lot of small farms don't necessarily have those options. The other way to fill those gaps is with supplemental feeding. The whole purpose of supplemental feeding is to provide nutrients that the primary diet, and in this case forage, is lacking. You know, sheep and goats are ruminants. We want them to consume a forage diet, but that forage diet doesn't always meet their nutritional requirements. Sometimes the supplementation will allow them to make better use of the nutrients in the forage, especially low-quality forage. Sometimes you need to supplement to meet performance targets. You know, you want to give them the opportunity to produce enough milk or to reach a certain rate of gain. Sometimes weather necessitates the need for supplemental feeding, drought. You know, we think of feeding hay in the wintertime, but a lot of times if you don't do anything in the summertime, sometimes you have to feed hay in the summertime. To stretch the forage resource, if you supplement, in some cases they won't decrease their consumption of pasture, but in many cases they will, depending on how you do it. And in many cases that's desirable. You know, if I feed the lambs or kids more, I save the pasture for the ewes and the does. The most important thing about supplementation is it should be economical. Sometimes it's necessary from an animal welfare standpoint, but once I meet that requirement, I need that supplementation to be economical. You know, creep feeding is a perfect example. We know creep feeding tends to improve the performance of lambs and kids, but is it economical? They recently are in the process or in the middle of a study with meat goats at Tennessee State University, and they found it to be beneficial for the bucklings but not the doe kids. So you want to make sure whatever supplementation, once you meet the animal welfare need, is economical. Why, you know, but why supplement? Okay, in the case of the females, one reason to supplement is flushing. Flushing is when you increase the nutrient intake of ewes and does prior to the breeding season and during the early part of breeding season. The purpose is to try to get a higher lambing and kidding percentage. The early part, before breeding, is the idea to get a higher ovulation rate. In the early part of breeding season is to get higher or better embryo survival. Late gestation might be a reason to supplement, particularly if you have prolific females or if you're in an accelerated lambing or kidding program. Lactation, certainly dairy females, in order to get high milk production, are going to require supplementation. But again, a lot of the prolific breeds, if you want them to do a good job with triplets, you probably have to supplement. For the lambs and kids, the reason to supplement is to improve their growth rates, to improve their parasite tolerance, to put a finish on them for market, to meet specific target markets, to help develop your replacement females. I'm a strong believer in breeding ewes and does so that they're moms by the time they're 1 year old, somewhere between 12 and 15 months of age. Sometimes the only way you're going to get her big enough is if you supplement her. When I say big enough, she needs to be about 2/3 of the size of the females in your flock or herd. So if you've got 150-pound does or 150-pound ewes, you need 100-pound females before you should breed them. The other time is supplementation is sometimes used as a carrier. If you want to make sure your ewes get enough selenium in their diet, you put it in a grain ration because you don't know how much minerals they consume. And if you don't know what the mineral content of your forages is, you know, you can make them consume it. If you want to do out-of-season breeding, and one way to do it is to feed MGA, so you need to feed. Some of the means of dealing with or controlling abortions, you can feed an antibiotic to help prevent abortions. You can feed a coccidiostat to help prevent toxoplasmosis abortions, but also to help control coccidiosis. Yes, you can do it in the mineral, but you're not going to be guaranteed adequate intake. Sericea lespedeza has been shown to have an anti-parasitic effect. Not everybody can plant it. Not everybody wants to plant it. Not everybody can buy hay. Not everybody wants to buy the hay. They have pelletized it. And so if you can buy the pellets, sometimes they're hard to get because they can't meet the market, but they can be used for parasite control. They can be used for coccidiosis control. There's a product that we're hoping to hit that's going to eventually hit the U.S. market is a fungus that you feed through the animals, and it helps reduce parasites. It doesn't deworm them, but it interferes with the parasite's life cycle. It inhibits egg hatching and larva development, and so you'd have to feed that fungus. So there can be reasons to feed, even just using some feed to manage and train animals as well. But there can be different reasons for supplementation. There's basically 3 types of supplementation or supplemental feeding. One is what we would call supplementation. The animal eats the supplement and pasture intake is not reduced. You'll read a lot of fact sheets that'll tell you don't feed more than 0.5% of body weight. I think our goats last year, we fed them about 1.5% of body weight. Substitution is some of the supplement that they eat, they're going to eat it instead of pasture. That may be desirable or undesirable. It depends. In the case of our buck test, I consider it undesirable because we want them to eat more pasture. If you're saving pasture, trying to stretch that resource, then it's not undesirable. And there is situations, again, where you supplement an animal and it complements their forage diet. They make better use of those nutrients. Lots of different types of supplements. Technically, salt and mineral mixes are supplements, and there's different opinions on what you should give pastured animals. I'd say the general recommendation is to offer free choice minerals, and we do that for the same reason we all might take a vitamin, is we don't know that we're consuming enough of those vitamins and minerals, so we do it kind of just in case. There are people that don't think you need to feed mineral mixes, particularly the calcium and phosphorus that are in them, and would just put salt out there for them. We have a whole variety of lick tubs or nutritional tubs. Some of them are mostly minerals, some of them are high protein, some of them are high energy. I put them in that group above because they're not going to consume very much of these nutrients. So if you're trying to get more energy into an animal, they're not going to get that much out of a lick tub compared to you feeding some type of feed. They're very expensive. Of course, their big advantage is labor. You don't have to get out there and feed every day. But I'll also say with supplementation, you don't have to do that every day. When we talk about supplements, we talk about hay, we talk about grain, and then we'll talk about roughage feeds. Hay, of course, we often put out when we have drought conditions. Sometimes people keep it out all year. I mean, the whole time they're out there grazing. I don't think you have to, but some people do. Some people make it available when they are grazing a very lush forage, brassicas, for example. Grain is probably the most economical source of supplement, and when I say grain, I don't mean ABC goat pellets. I mean corn, barley, cereal grains. From an economic standpoint, they're usually the cheapest way to get energy into an animal. And then the roughage feeds, which I want to talk about. We have the roughage feeds, or what I would call a fibrous byproduct feed. They're byproducts of grains or other commodity processing. They're defined as being less than 18% crude, or greater than 18% crude fiber, less than 70% TDN, and I guess less than 5.5% fat. I forgot to put the sign up there. They're mostly hull type diets. Almond hulls, cottonseed hulls, old hulls, peanut hulls, and soybean hulls. And you can see what the nutritional value of each of these feeds is. They vary considerably in crude fiber, total digestible nutrients, crude protein, and fat. EE stands for ether extract. The one I have highlighted, and a lot of the availability of these is going to depend on where you're located geographically, but the one I have highlighted is soybean hulls. It actually doesn't meet that 70% TDN requirement. It's actually quite high in TDN. The book value is, if you actually test, all byproduct feeds can be quite variable, but the book value is up at 77% TDN and 13% crude fiber. That's a pretty, crude protein, that's a pretty darn good feed, a pretty balanced all-around feed, whether you're talking about feeding it to animals while they're grazing or feeding it to animals out of a feeder in a dry lot situation. But it does qualify as one of these fibrous byproduct feeds because it's considered to be healthy for the rumen. The roughage feeds are low in starch. When an animal eats, there's different bugs, microorganisms in the rumen, and there's different ones that digest starch, and there's different ones that digest these different types of feeds. And so if I feed these soy hulls to an animal that's grazing or an animal that's eating hay, they're going to complement each other. If I feed corn, they're going to need different bugs, microorganisms, to digest the starch in corn. And so for this reason, they're permissible under USDA grass-fed standards. So if your goal is to market a grass-fed lamb, you can get a premium for a grass-fed lamb. It suits your philosophy of how you think lambs can be raised, but you're having a difficulty meeting your production goals. This is something you might want to consider, supplementing with something like soybean hulls. From an economic standpoint, I can tell you that corn is always cheaper, but when you balance the different reasons you do different things, this could certainly be a good choice. Soybean hulls in particular, this is what we feed. I also feed them at home sometimes. They're a co-product of soybean processing. They're the outer part of the soybean. They pelletize them, and I have found that the pellets vary considerably. Here they look somewhat powdery. We started our goats off with this type of pellet. I switched to a more concise pellet that wasn't so dusty. Dusty's maybe not the right word, powdery. The goats did not like that one. They preferred these, and these were a lot cheaper too. When they've done studies, and this is particularly true with cattle, I don't know if studies have been done with as much with small ruminants, but they find that even though the corn is higher in TDN, up around 88, and the soy hulls are down or more like around 75 on TDN, they find that they're equal. That the pound of corn and the pound of soy hulls are equal from a nutritional standpoint. So you can supplement pound for pound, pound for pound. If we look at them from a forage standpoint, and keep in mind they're still not a long forage. So the need for a ruminant animal to have a long forage of their diet, it's still not met by soy hulls. It's still not quite the same. But they do have a lot more energy per pound than most forages. And I think actually I got a typo here. A pound of soy hulls replaces about 1.4 pounds of forage. So it is possible to substitute in a harvested feeding program to substitute either it for grain or hay, and in the case of pasture, to supplement. The last thing I want to discuss is we talk about the quality of pasture and measuring that through the testing of forages and the testing of the feces to see if our nutritional program is adequate. But again, we don't know about intake. We don't know about the quantity of nutrients that they're consuming. So we basically got to look at the animal to tell us that. And we can look at their health. If they're more susceptible to parasites, for example, inadequate nutrition might be one of the reasons. We can look at their performance, primarily in the case of a dairy animal. Of course, we're looking at milk production. In the case of a meat animal, rate of gain. We weigh the bucks in our test, every 2 weeks. I know what they're gaining. Okay, and probably the best way to evaluate our nutritional program when it's predominantly pasture, where we can't measure intake, is to look at their body condition score. Body condition scoring is probably one of the most important and practical tools for a livestock producer to use, regardless of what species they have, because it's an excellent way to evaluate health, but also to evaluate nutrition. We body condition score the bucks in our test every 2 weeks. We consider it one of the measures of health in terms of parasites, because parasites will cause an animal to lose body condition. Other diseases will cause an animal to lose body condition. But also nutrition will cause an animal to lose body condition. I don't expect an animal that's on a strictly forage diet to be as fat as one that's getting, concentrate. but I have an expectation of what that animal should be on pasture, and if it's below, then I have to question the nutritional program. Maybe I'll have to supplement. The important thing about body condition is to understand you can't do it from a distance. Even with a slick-haired goat like this, you have to handle them. We typically handle them on their, right where you see the hand there, back on the loin, feeling the backbone and the spinous processes of the loin. We're feeling for fat cover. We're also feeling for the fullness of muscle. The other place we tend to feel would be up at the other end, up towards the shoulders, where we feel the backbone and the ribs. We tend to use a scoring system of 1 to 5 using half score increments. We always tend to use 1 through 5 for sheep. I have seen goats 1 through 5 as well as 1 through 9. A 1 through 9 system is what they use for cattle and a lot of other animals. The only difference between the two systems is one uses full scores and one uses half scores. So an animal that's extremely thin with no fat reserves is a 1. That's an animal that your local humane society should come pick up. Healthy animals are going to be between 2.5 and 4. When the animals start to get below 2, particularly kids and lambs out on pasture, I'm concerned about the nutrition. I'm not, if a ewe just weaned her lambs or a doe just weaned her kids and she's in body condition score, that 2, that's probably okay. I'd prefer it to be 2.5. I don't want her to get over 4. 4 is fat. A very over-conditioned or obese animal is going to be a 5. I've only ever scored between 1.5 and 4.5 because I always figure there can be a thinner animal than I've seen and a fatter animal than I've seen. Body condition scoring is relative. You need to be consistent. You need to have in your mind what average is and what you want that animal to be when they breed, when they lamb, when they kid, when you wean them, when they're ready for market. This is something that you should do all the time, and if you're really focused on raising animals on pasture, this is not just, you just don't do it at breeding and weaning. You need to do it throughout the grazing season if you're grazing kids and lambs. Because again, it's an indication of whether the nutrition is adequate. It's also an indication of whether those animals are ready for market. Because when an animal is, let's say it's a body condition score of 1.5, not only does it not have fat, but it doesn't have meat either. It's not developed. So we can also use it to determine when animals are ready for market. Again, we don't need fat animals, but we need some condition. We need some finish on them, some fullness in that loin. And with that, I will conclude. This is another one of our bucks in our test. This was back in the pasture that had a lot of variety for them to graze. Our last webinar will be next week, and we're going to talk about pasture health problems. And again, I'm not going to talk about the health problems of the pasture, but the health problems of the animals that are on pasture. Things like parasites, things like bloat, things like the effects of the infected tall fescue. Some of those kinds of things is what we're going to talk about next week. All production scenarios, situations have health risks, and they just are different. They're just different depending on your production system. Predators is another issue that's going to be more of a problem potentially on pasture than it is in a dry ladder confinement situation. So we're going to talk about some of those different things that can happen on pasture.